The city buzzed around me, its lights flickering like static electricity in the cold evening air. I had barely finished my last email at the marketing firm where I'd spent the last 3 years of my life before bolting out the door. My phone buzzed, the ride-hailing app flashing that Brian was 2 minutes away. Relief washed over me. Finally, a chance to breathe. I was running late, as usual. Juggling the weight of deadlines and my own relentless overthinking, I almost missed the black car that slowed to a stop in front of me. "Emily?" the driver asked, leaning slightly out of the window. He had a calm, steady voice that somehow cut through the chaos around us. "That's me," I nodded, yanking the door open and sliding into the back seat. The leather felt cool against my skin as I fastened my seatbelt with a hurried click. Brian glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Rough day?" he asked, his tone light, yet oddly disarming. I gave a half-hearted laugh. "You could say that." The car pulled into traffic, and for a moment, the steady hum of the engine and the blurred city lights felt like a cocoon. Normally, I'd bury myself in my phone to avoid small talk, but something about Brian's presence felt different. He wasn't just polite, he seemed genuinely present. "How's your evening going?" he asked, glancing at me briefly through the mirror. The question was so simple, yet the warmth in his voice made me pause. I realized I couldn't remember the last time someone had asked me that and truly meant it. "Long," I admitted. "Work has been relentless." Brian nodded, his hands steady on the wheel. "I get that. What do you do?" "Marketing," I replied automatically, though my voice softened as I added, "It's exhausting, constantly trying to create ideas that resonate, while feeling like I'm running on empty." He smiled faintly, his eyes flicking to the mirror again. "It's funny, isn't it? How we get so caught up in the hustle that we forget to stop and breathe." His words hit harder than I expected. I studied his face in the dim light of the dashboard. There was something about his expression, a quiet understanding that felt like more than polite conversation. I wasn't sure why, but I felt compelled to keep talking. "Exactly," I said, surprised by the honesty in my own voice. "Sometimes it feels like I'm running after something, but I don't even know what it is anymore." Brian didn't reply right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch between us, comfortable and full. The city outside blurred into streaks of light, but inside the car, time seemed to slow. His presence was steady, grounding, like a calm anchor in a storm. "You're not alone in that," he finally said, his voice softer now. "I've been driving for years, and you wouldn't believe how many people feel the same way." His words lingered, and I found myself stealing a glance at him through the mirror. He caught my gaze and held it for a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't intrusive, but it was intentional, like he saw something in me I hadn't realized was there. I shifted in my seat, suddenly aware of the tension in the air. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was undeniably real. He glanced back at the road, breaking the moment, and I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You know," he continued, his tone still calm, "the way someone sits in the back seat says a lot about them." I frowned, intrigued despite myself. "What do you mean?" Brian chuckled lightly, a sound that felt warm and genuine. "People don't realize it, but they give so much away. The way they sit, the way they breathe, even the way they look out the window." The words were simple, but they felt layered, like he wasn't just talking about strangers in his car.
He was talking about me.
A knot tightened in my chest, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way his voice carried a weight that made me feel exposed, like I was suddenly a character in someone else's story. The tension between us thickened as the car slowed at a red light. For a brief second, the world outside felt distant, irrelevant. It was just me, Brian, and the unspoken connection hanging in the air. Then he asked, softly but directly, "What are you running from, Emily?" The question hit me like a thunderclap. My mind reeled. How could he possibly know? My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. His eyes met mine again in the mirror, steady and knowing, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. I opened my mouth to respond, but the light turned green, and the car surged forward. The moment passed, but the weight of his question lingered, pressing against my chest like an invisible hand. The car moved smoothly through the downtown streets, the rhythmic hum of the engine filling the silence between us. I couldn't shake Brian's question from my mind. "What are you running from, Emily?" It wasn't the kind of thing you expected from a stranger, and yet, somehow, it felt like the most honest thing anyone had asked me in years. He didn't push for an answer. Instead, he let the weight of his words settle between us, giving me space to process. It was strange. Usually, small talk felt like a barrier, a way to avoid anything real. But with Brian, it felt like he'd skipped all the surface-level nonsense and dove straight into the deep end. I exhaled slowly, watching the city lights streak past the window. "You know," I began hesitantly, "I don't usually talk about this stuff with anyone, let alone someone I just met." Brian glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his expression calm and encouraging. "Sometimes it's easier with someone who's not in your world," he said simply. "No judgment, no baggy." I nodded, chewing on his words. "Work's been overwhelming," I admitted, my voice quieter now. "It's like no matter how much I give, it's never enough. There's always another deadline, another campaign, another impossible goal. And it's not just the work, it's the pressure to keep up this image, you know? To always look like I have everything under control." Brian's hands tightened on the wheel, just slightly. "Yeah," he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. "It's like you're always running on a treadmill, and no matter how fast you go, you're still stuck in the same spot." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Exactly," I said, my voice breaking just a little. "And the worst part is, I don't even know what I'm chasing anymore. I used to love what I do. I used to feel alive.
But now?
It's like I'm just going through the motions." For a moment, Brian didn't say anything. The silence stretched out, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt intentional, like he was giving me the room to unpack everything I'd just said. Then he spoke, his voice low but steady. "We forget to stop and breathe," he said, almost like he was speaking to himself. "We get so caught up in chasing the next thing that we don't even realize we've lost sight of what matters." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. I felt something shift inside me, like a knot I hadn't even realized was there had started to loosen. He wasn't just saying it to make me feel better, he meant it. He knew what it felt like to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, to lose yourself in the hustle and noise. "How do you deal with it?" I asked softly, surprised by how much I wanted to hear his answer. Brian's gaze flicked to the mirror again, meeting mine for a brief moment before returning to the road. "I drive," he said with a small smile. "It sounds simple, but being out here on the road, it clears my head. It reminds me that life isn't just about getting somewhere, it's about the journey." I let his words sink in, feeling their weight settle in my chest. It wasn't the kind of answer I'd expected, but maybe that was the point. Brian wasn't trying to fix anything or offer a solution. He was just sharing his truth. "You make it sound easy," I said, though there was no bitterness in my tone. Just a quiet kind of longing. "It's not," he admitted. "But sometimes, all it takes is a moment. One deep breath to remind yourself you're still here." I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I let it out. The tension I'd been carrying all day, maybe all week, seemed to lift, if only slightly. I found myself staring at the back of Brian's head, wondering how someone I'd met less than 30 minutes ago could see me so clearly. We stopped at a red light, the glow casting soft shadows across his face. He turned his head slightly, meeting my gaze in the mirror once more. There was no judgment there, no pity, just understanding. "You're not alone, Emily," he said quietly. "You're not the only one who feels this way." The light turned green, and the car moved forward, but his words stayed with me. They settled in my mind like a seed, small but powerful. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel so isolated. I didn't feel like I was carrying everything on my own. As we drove on, the silence between us felt less like a void and more like a connection. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't want the ride to end. There was something about Brian, something steady and grounding, that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. But just as I started to relax, a thought crept into my mind, sharp and unwelcome. Why does he understand me so well? And that's when it hit me. There was more to Brian than he was letting on. The silence in the car wasn't the kind that made you reach for your phone or fidget with the radio. It wasn't empty or awkward. It felt like the kind of silence that carried weight, filled with things neither of us were saying but both of us could feel. Outside, the city continued to hum, neon signs and streetlights casting streaks of color across the car windows. I stared at them, my thoughts racing but oddly calm at the same time. It was as if something in me had shifted, some part of my guard had lowered, though I wasn't sure why. "You ever notice," Brian said suddenly, breaking the quiet, "how much people give away without even realizing it?" I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes steady, but not invasive. "When you've been driving as long as I have, you start to notice patterns. People get in the car thinking they're invisible, like I'm just a piece of the background. But the way they sit, the way they breathe, even the way they avoid eye contact, it all says something." I tilted my head, intrigued. "And what does it say?" Brian smiled faintly, his hands relaxed on the wheel. "Depends on the person. Some people are tense, like they're carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. Others sink into the seat, trying to escape something. Then there are the ones who can't stop checking their phones, like they're afraid of what might happen if they don't." "And me?" I asked before I could stop myself. "What do I give away?" His gaze lingered in the mirror a moment longer than usual, and I felt the air shift between us. "You're searching," he said finally, his voice softer now. "For something you've lost, maybe. Or something you're afraid you'll never find." The words hit like a direct shot to the chest. I looked down, fidgeting with the strap of my bag, to give my hand something to do. "That's a pretty bold assumption," I said, trying to sound light, but my voice betrayed me. "It's not an assumption," he said simply. "It's just what I see." I wanted to argue, to brush off his observation as a lucky guess, but I couldn't. Because he was right. I'd been feeling lost for so long, I didn't even know where to begin looking anymore. And now, this stranger, this driver I'd known for less than an hour, had managed to see straight through me. "How do you do that?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "How do you just read people like that?" "It's not magic," Brian said with a small shrug. "You just have to pay attention. People are always telling you who they are, you just have to listen." Something about his answer struck a nerve. How many times had I brushed off conversations, too wrapped up in my own world to really hear what someone was saying? How many connections had I missed because I was too busy chasing something I couldn't even define? "You make it sound so simple," I said, my tone edged with something I couldn't quite name. "Resentment? Longing?" "It's not simple," he admitted, "but it's worth it." The car slowed as we approached a red light, and for a moment, the glow of the traffic signal bathed us both in warm, muted light. I looked at him through the mirror, really looked, and felt something shift again. There was an intensity in his eyes, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made me feel like I was being seen, not just looked at, but truly seen. I wasn't sure what to do with that feeling. It was equal parts comforting and unsettling, like standing on the edge of a cliff and staring into the vastness below. I wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability, especially with someone I barely knew. But with Brian, it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable. "You've got a lot on your mind," he said, his tone gentler now. I nodded slowly.
"Yeah."
More than I realized. The light turned green, and the car moved forward again, but the tension between us didn't fade. If anything, it grew, like an invisible thread pulling us closer together. I could feel it in the air, in the way his words lingered, in the way my pulse quickened every time our eyes met in the mirror. This wasn't just small talk anymore. It wasn't just a ride home. Something unspoken was unfolding between us, something neither of us could name, but both of us could feel. And that's when it hit me. This connection, this strange and undeniable pull, wasn't random. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was something deeper, something that went beyond words or logic. But before I could fully process what was happening, Brian spoke again, his voice pulling me back to the present. You don't have to carry it all alone, you know. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. What if I don't know how to let go? His eyes met mine in the mirror, steady and unwavering. Then maybe it's time to learn. The weight of his words settled over me, heavy and undeniable. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel alone in my struggle. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. This ride was changing everything. The car hummed steadily, a gentle vibration that matched the rhythm of my thoughts. The city outside the windows had shifted, fewer neon lights, more quiet residential streets, but the air inside the car felt heavier, almost charged. I'd told myself I'd just take this ride, get home, and forget about the day. But this was no ordinary ride, and Brian was no ordinary driver. He broke the silence again, his voice low, almost contemplative. Do you ever feel like the world's moving too fast? I blinked, startled by the question. It seemed to come out of nowhere, but the way he said it felt like he'd been holding on to it, waiting for the right moment to ask. All the time, I admitted, my voice quieter now. It feels like no matter what I do, I can't keep up. There's always something I'm supposed to be doing, supposed to be achieving. And if I stop for even a second, I feel like I'm falling behind. Brian nodded slowly, his hands steady on the wheel. It's exhausting, isn't it? Like you're sprinting on a treadmill, but you don't even know where it's taking you. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, my chest tightening. How did he keep doing this? Saying exactly what I was feeling before I could even put it into words? It's more than exhausting, I said, my voice tinged with frustration. It's suffocating. Like there's this invisible clock ticking over my head, and no matter how fast I move, I'll never have enough time. Brian's eyes flicked to the mirror, meeting mine with that same calm, steady gaze. Maybe the problem isn't the clock, he said quietly. Maybe it's what you think you're racing against. I froze, his words hitting me like a slap. I'd never thought about it that way before. My whole life had been one long race, against deadlines, against expectations, against myself. But I'd never stopped to ask why I was running in the first place. What if I don't even know what I'm racing toward? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Brian smiled faintly, his eyes still on the road. Then maybe it's time to stop running and figure it out. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I stared out the window, my reflection faint against the glass, and felt a lump rise in my throat. How had this stranger managed to see me so clearly? How had he managed to cut through the walls I'd spent years building around myself? It's not that simple, I said, my voice cracking slightly. Maybe not, Brian agreed. But isn't it worth trying? I didn't know how to respond. I'd spent so long moving, chasing, striving, that the idea of stopping, of letting go, felt almost impossible. But the way Brian spoke, the quiet conviction in his voice, made me wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was right. You make it sound easy, I said finally, my tone edged with both longing and disbelief. It's not, he said, his voice soft but firm. But sometimes, the hardest things are the ones that matter most. I looked at him in the mirror again, really looked, and felt that strange pull in my chest, the one that made me feel both exposed and understood. It was terrifying and comforting all at once, like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing you might just have wings. Why do you care? I asked suddenly, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Brian glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. Because I've been where you are, he said simply. And I know how it feels to think you're alone in it. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to ask him more, to dig into his story and understand what had brought him to this point. But there was something in his tone, something raw and unspoken, that made me hesitate. Instead, I let the silence stretch out between us, the weight of his words settling over me like a blanket. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to articulate the swirl of emotions inside me. Brian spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to say anything. Just let yourself feel it. I closed my eyes, leaning back against the seat, and let out a shaky breath. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to stop just for a moment. And in that moment, I felt something shift, like a door I hadn't even realized was locked had started to creak open. When I opened my eyes, Brian was watching me in the mirror, his gaze steady and unwavering. It should have been unnerving, but instead, it felt like an anchor, grounding me in a way I didn't know I needed. You see me, I said softly, the words more for myself than for him. I do, he said simply. And just like that, the tension in the car shifted. It wasn't just a ride anymore. It wasn't just small talk. It was something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. But before I could fully process what was happening, Brian turned onto a quieter street, the hum of the city fading into the background. The moment felt fragile, like it could shatter at any second. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I wanted it to. The quiet rhythm of the car felt like a heartbeat, steady but heavy with unspoken tension. I couldn't stop stealing glances at Brian through the rearview mirror. His face, calm yet focused, seemed to hold 1,000 stories, and I wanted to know every one of them. It wasn't like me to feel this way, to let myself get pulled into someone else's orbit. But with Brian, it was like gravity, inevitable and impossible to resist. My chest tightened. The air between us felt charged, as if the words we weren't saying were louder than the ones we were. I didn't know what to make of it, this strange connection that had formed in the space of a single car ride. It made me feel exposed, vulnerable in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake the feeling. You must meet a lot of people doing this, I said, my voice barely breaking the quiet. Brian nodded.
Ida.
But it's not about how many people you meet, it's about the ones who stay with you. His words hung in the air, and I felt my pulse quicken. I wanted to ask if he meant me, if this moment felt as significant to him as it did to me, but the thought made my throat tighten. Vulnerability wasn't my strong suit. Why do I feel like you're trying to say something without actually saying it? I asked, forcing a lightness into my tone to mask the weight of my emotions. Brian glanced at me in the mirror, his gaze steady and unreadable. Because I am. My breath caught. There it was again, that pull, that sense that he saw something in me I wasn't ready to confront. I wanted to ask him what he saw, but before I could speak, he broke the silence. Emily, he said, his voice softer now. It seems like you're running from something. The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. My chest tightened, my heart racing as if it had been exposed to the open air. What makes you think that? I asked, though my voice was shaky, defensive. Brian didn't look away from the road, but his words carried a weight that felt impossible to ignore. It's not hard to see when you know what to look for. The way you talk about work, about the pressure, about feeling like you can't keep up, it's all there. I wanted to push back, to argue, but I couldn't, because he was right. I'd been running for so long, I didn't even know what I was running toward or away from. Before I could respond, a loud honk shattered the stillness. I jerked forward as the car swerved slightly, Brian's hands gripping the wheel tightly. Hold on, he said, his voice calm but urgent. The car in front of us had stopped abruptly, its hazard lights flashing. Brian slowed to a stop, his jaw tight as he scanned the road ahead. Looks like a fender bender, he said, more to himself than to me. But then I noticed something, movement on the sidewalk. A man, tall and disheveled, was pacing back and forth near the scene, his gestures erratic. Something about him felt off, like he was on the verge of losing control. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tinged with unease. Brian followed my gaze, his expression darkening. "Stay in the car," he said firmly, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Wait, what are you doing?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. But Brian was already stepping out of the car, his calm demeanor replaced with a sharp focus. I watched as he approached the man, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. My heart pounded as I strained to hear their exchange, but the muffled sounds of the city swallowed their voices. The man's movements became more frantic, and I felt my stomach knot. I didn't know what Brian thought he was doing, but I couldn't just sit there and watch. Against every instinct telling me to stay put, I unbuckled my seatbelt and cracked the door open, the cold night air biting against my skin. "Brian," I called out, my voice shaking. "What's going on?" He turned to look at me, his face a mix of frustration and concern. "Get back in the car, Emily," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. But before I could move, the man suddenly lunged toward Brian, his voice rising in anger. Everything happened in a blur. Brian sidestepped him, his movements quick and controlled, and managed to grab the man's arm, holding him back with surprising strength. "Call 911, Brian shouted, his eyes locking with mine. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed. My mind raced, the adrenaline coursing through me making it hard to think straight. As I explained the situation to the operator, I couldn't help but keep my eyes on Brian. He didn't look afraid, he looked focused, determined. The tension in the air was almost suffocating, and my chest felt tight as I watched the scene unfold. Brian managed to de-escalate the situation enough to keep the man from hurting himself, or anyone else, until the flashing lights of a police car appeared in the distance. When it was over, Brian returned to the car, his face calm but his eyes betraying a flicker of exhaustion. He slid into the driver's seat and exhaled slowly, gripping the wheel for a moment before turning to look at me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice steady but softer now. I nodded, my throat tight with unspoken emotions. "What about you?" Brian gave me a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've had worse nights." But as we pulled back onto the road, the tension between us felt different. The connection we'd been building all night hadn't just deepened, it had solidified, forged in the heat of the chaos we'd just been through. And yet, as the silence returned, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something about Brian, about this night, felt unfinished, like we'd reached the edge of something neither of us fully understood. The tension from the chaotic moment earlier lingered in the air, but Brian's calm demeanor worked like a balm, easing the jagged edges of my nerves. The city felt quieter now as we continued down the road, the sound of the tires against the pavement steady and grounding. I couldn't help but glance at him again through the rearview mirror. His face was composed, but there was a softness in his eyes that made me feel seen in a way I couldn't quite describe. "You don't have to run, Emily," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the stillness. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My heart skipped a beat, the truth of his statement hitting me squarely in the chest. I'd spent so much of my life running, toward expectations, away from fears, and always against time. But hearing him say it, with such quiet conviction, made something inside me shift. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. "How do you always know exactly what to say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Brian glanced at me briefly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's not about knowing what to say," he replied. "It's about listening to what isn't being said." I felt my chest tighten again, but this time it wasn't fear or anxiety. It was something else. Something lighter, warmer. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. "Brian," I said, my voice steady now, "can you pull over for a moment?" His brows furrowed slightly, but he didn't question me. Instead, he nodded, guiding the car to a quiet spot along the side of the road. The soft glow of a nearby street lamp bathed the car in warm light, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. "Everything okay?" he asked, turning slightly in his seat to look at me. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of vulnerability and courage bubbling up inside me. I wanted to say thank you," I said, my voice soft but resolute. "For listening. For being here. You didn't have to, but you did. And it means more than I can put into words." Brian's expression softened, the corners of his mouth lifting into a gentle smile. "You don't have to thank me, Emily," he said. "Sometimes, all someone needs is to know they're not alone." I felt a wave of emotion rise in my chest, gratitude, relief, and something else I couldn't quite name. "It's more than that," I said. "You didn't just listen. You reminded me that I don't have to carry it all by myself. That maybe it's okay to stop running." His gaze met mine, steady and reassuring. "It is," he said simply. For a moment, the silence between us felt charged again, but this time, it wasn't heavy or tense. It was warm, comforting, a quiet understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. I reached out, placing a hand lightly on his arm where it rested on the center console. "Thank you," I said again, my voice thick with emotion. Brian looked at me, his expression unreadable for a moment before he nodded. "You're stronger than you think, Emily," he said. "You'll be okay. I know you will." The certainty in his voice sent a shiver down my spine, but not in a way that frightened me. It felt like an anchor, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Let's get you home," he said after a moment, his tone light but still carrying that undercurrent of sincerity. I nodded, leaning back into the seat as he guided the car back onto the road. The rest of the ride passed in a quiet but comfortable silence. When we finally reached my destination, I hesitated before stepping out of the car, my hand lingering on the door handle. As I turned to look at him one last time, he offered me a small, reassuring smile. "You'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady and kind. I nodded, a soft smile of my own tugging at my lips. "Good night, Brian." "Good night, Emily," he replied, and with that, I stepped out into the cool night air. As the car pulled away, I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the evening settle over me. Something had changed, not just in the way I felt, but in the way I saw myself. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was running. And for the first time, I felt like I might actually be okay. The door to my apartment clicked shut behind me, the faint hum of the city muffled by the thick walls. I set my bag on the counter and leaned against it, staring blankly at the dimly lit space. Normally, I'd collapse onto the couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone until I fell asleep. But tonight, I couldn't shake the weight of everything that had happened. I kicked off my shoes and sank into the armchair by the window, the streetlights outside casting soft patterns on the walls. My thoughts raced, each one pulling me back to the quiet moments in Brian's car, his steady voice, and the way his words seemed to echo truths I hadn't dared to admit to myself. "You don't have to run." I'd replayed that sentence a dozen times in my mind, each repetition peeling back another layer of meaning. It wasn't just about my job or the endless pressure to keep up appearances. It was about everything. My fear of failure, my reluctance to confront the emptiness I'd been masking with busyness, my refusal to let anyone see how deeply it all weighed on me. Brian had seen it, though. He'd seen it without me having to say a word, and that terrified me. But it also gave me a strange sense of relief, like I wasn't as invisible as I thought. I closed my eyes, his final words lingering in my mind. "You're stronger than you think. You'll be okay." A lump formed in my throat, and I took a deep, shaky breath. He'd said it with such certainty, as if he knew something about me that I couldn't see yet. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was drowning. Instead, I felt still, like maybe, just maybe, I could find my way back to solid ground. I stood and paced the room, the restless energy building in my chest. I didn't know what to do with it. My mind raced through every moment of the night. The chaos, the calm, the way Brian had somehow cracked open a part of me I hadn't even realized was locked. Stopping in front of the mirror, I stared at my reflection. The woman looking back at me seemed different, though I couldn't quite pinpoint how. Her shoulders weren't as tense, her eyes not as shadowed. She looked ready. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. For so long, I'd been afraid of change, afraid of failure, afraid of letting go. But now, standing there in the quiet stillness of my apartment, I felt something shift. I wasn't afraid anymore. I didn't know what came next, but for the first time in years, that didn't scare me. I was ready to face it, whatever it was. My phone buzzed on the counter, snapping me out of my thoughts. I crossed the room and picked it up, expecting another work email or a notification I didn't care about. But when I looked at the screen, my breath caught. It was a message from an unknown number. Brian, I hope you got home safe. And I hope you remember what I said. You're stronger than you think, Emily. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. How had he? Then I remembered. I'd given him my number earlier when he needed it for the app after the incident. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, 1,000 possible responses running through my mind. But before I could type anything, another message came through. Brian, sometimes the hardest part is taking the first step. Don't be afraid to take it. I froze, the words hitting me like a lightning strike. My heart raced, my mind spinning with possibilities. I wanted to reply, to say something, but the lump in my throat made it impossible. And then, as I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, something shifted again. This wasn't just about Brian. It wasn't about the ride or even the words he'd spoken.
It was about me.
I looked back at the mirror, at the woman who no longer felt like a stranger. My breath steadied, my pulse slowing as clarity settled over me like a warm blanket. I was ready for what I didn't know, but I was ready to find out. I typed a quick reply, my fingers trembling as I hit send. Thank you.
For everything.
The phone buzzed again almost immediately. Brian, you're welcome, Emily. Take care of yourself. And just like that, the screen went dark, leaving me standing there, a quiet smile forming on my lips. The future stretched out before me, vast and unknown, but for the first time, I wasn't running from it. I was running toward it.